Las Vegas. A night when the room was quiet in the wrong way. Not because the audience was bored, but because one table in the front row didn't applaud. Closest to the stage. One guard standing, one refusing to sit. A glass of whiskey untouched, not forgotten, not delayed. Untouched. This man didn't buy tickets. He ordered evenings. And tonight, he wasn't here for a performance. He wanted Dean Martin for himself. The message reached backstage in a whisper, passed carefully, like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. When it was spoken inside the dressing room, the air changed. Conversation stopped. No one looked at Dean, because everyone already knew what it meant. This wasn't a request. It was a test. Say yes, and you set a price on your voice. Say no, and you find out how expensive silence can be. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He did something far riskier. What he chose that night didn't start a fight. It ended one before it ever began. And long after the lights went out, people in Las Vegas remembered that evening not for the song that was sung, but for the one man who learned he couldn't own it. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas in the early 60s didn't belong to neon. The light was just the costume. Real ownership lived in the back rooms, behind felt-covered doors where voices stayed low, and decisions outlived the men who made them. Casinos, like the Sands, the Riviera, the Desert Inn, weren't just places to lose money with a smile. They were offices, half public, half untouchable. The stage was only 10 steps away from rooms where contracts were never written, and favors were never forgotten. Dean Martin knew this as well as anyone who worked the Strip and stayed alive long enough to grow comfortable there. He wasn't fooled by tuxedos or maîtres calling him Sir. He understood that his name on the marquee didn't mean freedom. It meant leverage. Stars sold tickets. Tickets laundered money. Money bought silence. And silence, in that city, was the most expensive thing of all. The request didn't arrive like a threat. That would have been crude. It came wrapped in familiarity, carried by a man who had shaken Dean's hand for years, a man who had helped smooth things over when schedules slipped or contracts got complicated. Someone who had once quietly ensured a problem disappeared before Dean ever heard about it. That was what made it dangerous. They met in a corner booth, away from the music, away from the smell of spilled bourbon. The man didn't name names. He didn't have to. He spoke carefully, like someone discussing weather that might ruin a crop. There was a gentleman in town, a respected one. He admired Dean's voice, admired it enough to want it uninterrupted. Just once. Private. Simple. Dean listened without reacting. He noticed the details instead, the untouched glass, the way the man avoided certain words, the pause before he mentioned past help. Not favors, he said, just things that happened to work out. Dean understood the language. Help was never retroactive. It always arrived with interest. Only then did the full shape of the problem surface. This wasn't a one-night indulgence. The man behind the request had already intervened before, redirected a booking here, eased pressure there. Quietly, without permission. Refusing now wouldn't be a private disagreement. It would be a statement. Agreeing would be worse. It would set a pattern that never stopped. Dean wasn't afraid. Fear was noisy. This was colder than that. He measured outcomes the way seasoned men do, by what they would cost 10 years later. He knew that once a singer belonged to one table, every other table would expect the same. He also knew the audience didn't come to watch him bend. The Strip hummed outside, indifferent. Somewhere, A band rehearsed a tune he'd sung 100 times. Dean thought of earlier rooms, earlier lessons, of how power rarely announced itself. It waited. And as he stood to leave the booth, the decision hadn't been made yet, but the ground beneath it was already set. The memory didn't arrive gently. It never did. It came the way old instincts always surfaced, with clarity sharpened by time. Long before Las Vegas learned how to polish danger until it looked like entertainment, Dean Martin had grown up around men who never raised their voices because they never needed to. He learned early that real authority didn't explain itself. It waited to see how you behaved when no one was watching. As a young man with an Italian name and a face that didn't look built for trouble, Dean understood the geography of power before he ever stepped on a real stage. He knew which rooms mattered, which conversations were rehearsals for something else, and which smiles were accounting tools. He also learned the most important survival rule: never answer the question that's actually being asked. In those days, nothing was offered without context. A door opened, a job appeared, a problem dissolved. No one ever said why, and you never asked. Gratitude was assumed. Debt was implied. Saying no outright was considered childish. Saying yes too quickly marked you as owned. The men who lasted were the ones who learned to live in the space between. That was the education Dean carried with him into fame. By the time he was headlining rooms, people pretended belonged to glamour. He already knew how the machinery behind the velvet worked. Nobody threatened him now, just as nobody had threatened him then. Instead, expectations arrived disguised as concern, admiration, respect. "It's nothing," they'd say, "just one thing." This request was not different in spirit, only in scale. The manager insisted it was harmless, ade private indulgence. The man was generous, loyal, predictable. "He just wants attention," the manager said, lowering his voice. "We give him that, and everyone sleeps easier." Dean didn't argue. He didn't need to. He saw what the manager couldn't afford to admit. This wasn't about a song. It was about hierarchy. Interrupting the show would redraw the lines, placing one man above the room, above the audience, above the unspoken agreement between performer and crowd. Once that line moved, it would never return to where it had been. He felt the pull of habit, the old reflex to keep things smooth. He also felt something quieter, but firmer underneath it. He had built his reputation not on defiance, but on consistency. People came to hear him because, for a few hours, the world made sense again. If he surrendered that, he wouldn't be betraying himself. He'd be betraying the room. Backstage, the minutes narrowed. The orchestra waited. Cigarette smoke thickened the air. Dean adjusted his cufflinks and caught his reflection. Not younger, not older, just aware. The past had given him tools, not orders. And as the stage manager signaled it was time, Dean stepped forward, knowing exactly what he wouldn't do, even if what he would do remained unspoken. The curtain hadn't risen yet, but the room was already listening. Las Vegas crowds learned patience the way desert towns learned thirst, by necessity. The light above the stage hummed, bright and unforgiving, flattening faces into anticipation. Somewhere in the dark, glasses clinked with deliberate care. The orchestra sat motionless, hands resting on polished instruments, waiting for a signal that usually came exactly on time. Dean Martin stood just beyond the spotlight, close enough to feel its heat. From there, he could see the front tables clearly. The arrangement was intentional. Power always liked proximity. One table in particular stood out, not for extravagance, but for the way space curved around it. Men nearby leaned back just a little, as if leaving room for gravity to work. The man who had made the request sat there comfortably, watching nothing and everything at once. Dean's expression didn't change. Calm wasn't an act for him. It was a discipline. He scanned the room, not searching for approval, but for balance. Couples dressed for a night they'd talk about later. Veterans with stiff shoulders. Women holding purses like anchors. None of them knew what was being weighed in that moment, and that mattered more than any contract ever could. The show was scheduled to open with a familiar number, something warm and reliable. Instead, Dean took a step forward earlier than planned. The movement was subtle, but the musicians noticed. The conductor lifted his head, surprised, then nodded. This wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Something was changing. Dean began with a song that sat lower in his voice, stripped of swagger. It wasn't obscure, but it wasn't safe either. The kind of melody you chose when you wanted people to lean in rather than lean back. The room responded instantly. Conversations stalled. Hands paused mid-gesture. The music didn't demand attention. It earned it. As he sang, Dean avoided the table that had been waiting for him. His eyes moved instead through the middle rows, settling briefly on faces that hadn't been invited by anyone. He sang to them without emphasis, without ceremony, as if reminding the room of a promise that had been made long before anyone else entered the conversation. Behind the scenes, no one moved. The manager stood frozen, calculating outcomes that no longer belonged to him. The usual cues were useless now. Dean wasn't breaking rules. He was choosing which ones mattered. The song ended without flourish. No punchline, no wink. Applause rose slowly, uneven at first, then gathered strength as people realized they were allowed to respond. Dean held the silence a fraction longer than etiquette suggested. Long enough for tension to stretch. Long enough for a single table to understand it hadn't been acknowledged. Nothing had been said. Nothing had been refused. And yet the answer was already forming. Not in words, but in posture. Dean stayed where he was, hand resting lightly on the microphone, waiting. The room breathed with him, unaware that the most important decision of the night was still unfolding, unresolved, and irreversible. The pause stretched just long enough to make people uneasy. Not uncomfortable, alert. Dean didn't acknowledge it. He didn't smile, didn't reset the mood the way seasoned performers were expected to. Instead, he lifted his hand slightly, not to cue applause or banter, but to guide the orchestra forward. They hesitated for a breath, then followed. They had learned, over years, to trust that when he moved this way, he knew exactly where the ground was. What came next wasn't on any program. The rhythm shifted, softer at first, then steadier, forcing the band to recalibrate in real time. A trumpet player adjusted mid-bar. The pianist glanced sideways, catching the new structure just in time. This wasn't improvisation for flair. It was control exercised quietly, without announcement. Behind the curtain, the manager felt it before he understood it. This wasn't deviation. This was a line being redrawn in public. He watched Dean's back, knowing there would be no rewind, no apology offered later in private. The show had been redefined, and the room would have to accept it. Dean didn't address the audience between songs. No jokes, no easy bridge. He let the music carry the transition, as if conversation would cheapen what was happening. When he finally spoke, it was brief and inclusive. He thanked everyone for coming, for listening, for sharing the night. The words were ordinary. The emphasis was not. This wasn't gratitude aimed upward. It spread outward, deliberately, leaving no single table elevated. The man in the front row noticed. He noticed because, Nothing else in the room shifted to accommodate him. Servers continued their routes. Cameras stayed wide. No gesture acknowledged his presence. For the first time that evening, the moment did not bend. Dean chose a song that carried double weight, about allegiance that could either save or betray, depending on who claimed it. He didn't frame it. He didn't dedicate it. He sang it clean, allowing the meaning to settle where it would. The lyrics landed differently across the room, each listener pulling something personal from them. That was the point. Ownership dissolved when shared. The cameras caught the reaction without commentary. Not anger, not approval, interest. The kind that sharpened the air instead of warming it. People leaned forward again, unsure whether they were witnessing defiance or something more dangerous. Independence. As the final notes faded, Dean didn't step back. He held his position, eyes steady, scanning the room once more. Then his gaze stopped, not challengingly, not submissively, but with expectation, as if waiting for a response that might never come. The silence lingered, heavier now, carrying a question no one would dare ask aloud. The invitation came without ceremony. No phone call, no message passed through intermediaries. A man in a plain suit appeared near the dressing room door, as if he had always been there, standing slightly aside so he wouldn't block the hallway. His voice was calm, professional, almost courteous. There was a room upstairs, a short walk. Someone would like a word. That was worse than any demand. In Las Vegas, urgency meant panic. Politeness meant certainty. Dean didn't look back at the manager. He didn't ask who would be waiting. He straightened his jacket, left the glass of water untouched, and followed. Going alone wasn't pride. It was precision. Fewer witnesses meant fewer interpretations later. The corridor behind the stage carried a different weight than the showroom. The carpet muted footsteps that had crossed it for decades. Men coming in confident and leaving quieter, or the other way around. The lighting was dimmer here, chosen not for atmosphere, but for discretion. Conversations had been buried in this space without ever being spoken. The room itself was smaller than expected. No windows, no ostentation. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a sense that nothing said inside would need repetition. The man from the front row was already seated, relaxed, hands open, posture unguarded. He gestured to the chair opposite him, not as an order, but as an assumption. There were no accusations, no raised voices. He thanked Dean for the evening, complimented the discipline of the performance, the way the room had been handled. He spoke like someone reviewing a well-executed transaction, without revealing what the transaction had been. Then he said what the night had really been about. He hadn't wanted a private song, he admitted. Not exactly. He had wanted to see what kind of man stood behind the voice, whether Dean sang for the highest bidder or for something harder to measure. The interruption request had been a test, a simple one. Most men failed it without realizing they were being examined. Then the offer shifted. One song. Not tonight. Not in this city. No money. No audience selected in advance. Just a voice, somewhere down the line, when the moment was right. The phrasing was careful. It could be heard as respect. It could just as easily be a delayed snare. Dean listened without interruption. He recognized the elegance of the trap. Accept, and you might owe nothing or everything. Refuse, and you'd clarify a boundary no one had crossed out loud. He didn't answer. Silence. Here wasn't avoidance. It was leverage. The man studied him, amused but attentive. "You're the only one tonight who didn't sing for me," he said finally. "That's why I want to hear you." The words settled between them, heavy and unfinished. Dean stood, adjusted his jacket once more, and nodded. Not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. He left the room the way he'd entered it, without haste. Behind him, the door closed softly, sealing a conversation whose consequences were only beginning to take shape. The night it surfaced again, there were no marquees flashing his name in defiance of the dark. No casino hum beneath the floorboards. The venue was smaller, cleaner in a way Las Vegas never was. Rows of simple chairs, a modest stage, the kind of place where sound traveled honestly, because nothing absorbed it. The event had a charitable purpose, announced weeks in advance, respectable enough to attract donors, but unremarkable enough to avoid spectacle. Dean arrived without entourage. No sense of occasion followed him in. The stakes, however, were higher than they had been under chandeliers and spotlights. This time, there would be no room to misinterpret intent. He stood on stage dressed plainly, voice steady, demeanor unguarded. The audience was different. Teachers, retired workers, couples who measured evenings by comfort rather than excitement. People who had never imagined themselves part of anyone's test. In the front row sat no figure of influence, no man with space carved out around him. If someone was watching closely, they did so anonymously, folded into the crowd like any other listener. The program unfolded as expected, until it didn't. Near the middle of the set, Dean slowed the pace without explanation. He spoke briefly, not to dedicate, not to frame, but to introduce a story, not his own. Just a moment about loyalty, about standing somewhere between obligation and choice, about the quiet weight of decisions that outlast applause. He didn't say why he was telling it. He didn't need to. Then came the song. It hadn't appeared on any printed program. The melody was familiar enough to feel safe, yet the delivery stripped it of comfort. He sang it without ornament, without leaning into sentiment. The phrasing left room, the kind that invites reflection rather than instruction. Each listener heard something slightly different, and that was precisely what prevented ownership. In that room, the song belonged to no one and everyone at once. Later, it would be whispered that a man had been present that night under a name no one recognized, that he had listened carefully and left without drawing attention, that he had heard exactly what he'd asked for, nothing more, nothing less, but on terms he hadn't set. Whether the rumor was true mattered less than how it spread. Quietly. Persistently. Dean didn't speak to the press afterward. He didn't clarify intent or offer interpretation. He left the building through a side door and went on with his schedule as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet something had shifted. Promoters talked differently. Invitations changed tone. The air around his name carried a subtle adjustment. Less familiarity, more distance. Not punishment. Recognition. The promise had been fulfilled without surrender. The request honored without obedience. And as the city lights faded behind him, Dean understood that whatever had been decided weeks earlier in a silent room had now been concluded in public, without a single person being able to claim the moment as their own. Time didn't announce what it had changed. It revealed it by omission. Weeks turned into months, seasons slid past, and something that had once felt inevitable simply stopped happening. No more quiet, special requests routed through managers. No discreet suggestions slipped into contracts. No late-night invitations with polite voices and sealed doors. In Las Vegas, absence could be a warning. Here, it was something else. Dean noticed it the way a man notices when a room stops testing him. Not relief. He wasn't built for relief. More like a pressure lifting from a shoulder you'd forgotten was tense. Promoters still smiled, still praised, still offered prime slots and generous terms. But the tone had altered. They didn't lean in too close. They didn't speak in codes. They treated him the way you treat someone whose boundaries have already been mapped. Carefully, without curiosity. He didn't tell anyone why. He didn't craft a legend out of it. He didn't need the story to travel with his name. If a song required an explanation to be understood, it wasn't worth singing. That was how he'd always lived, letting the work carry the meaning, letting the moment stand without rescue. One night, after a show in a different room, a musician, older, blunt, the kind of man who had played for everybody and feared almost nobody, caught Dean near the bandstand. The crowd was gone, chairs being stacked, the last of the smoke drifting toward the ceiling vents. The musician didn't smile when he spoke. "You know they were checking you that night," he said. Dean didn't ask who. He didn't ask how the musician knew. He just nodded once, as if the statement described weather Dean had already dressed for. "I knew before I walked out," Dean replied. "No swagger in it, no pride, just fact." The musician studied him, then looked away, as though seeing the strip in his mind, and everything that hid behind it. "Most guys would have tried to prove something," he muttered. Dean's expression stayed even. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," he said. "I was trying not to borrow trouble." That was the heart of it. He hadn't fought the machine. He hadn't mocked it, or tempted it into retaliation. He had simply refused to let it purchase the space between notes, the invisible part where a performer decides who he belongs to. He kept that space public, where it couldn't be owned without being exposed. Years later, people would still tell stories about Vegas, names, rumors, shadows moving behind money. Yet one detail remained oddly consistent. That particular man was never spoken alongside Dean's name again. Not as a sponsor, not as an enemy, not even as a footnote. In a town that loved to brag about influence, that silence was louder than any headline. Dean went on working, as steady as ever. Same voice, same measured humor, same calm command of a room. But those who understood the old rules sensed a new one had quietly taken root. There were some artists you could book, some you could buy, and a rare few you could only respect. In the end, there was no victory speech, no moral delivered to the audience, just a record of what happened. A man stood under lights, gave people what they came for, and never surrendered the part of himself that couldn't be billed. And when the last applause faded, what lingered wasn't noise. It was the clean, physical weight of restraint, silence that said more than any threat ever could.